Chapter 2. Tsarist Russia in the War. Russia's participation in the war was self-contradictory both in motives and in aims. That bloody struggle was waged essentially for world domination. In this sense, it was beyond Russia's scope. The war aims of Russia herself, the Turkish Straits, Galicia, Armenia, were providential in character and to be decided only incidentally according to the degree in which they answered the interests of the principal contestants. At the same time, Russia, as one of the great powers, could not help participating in the scramble of the advanced capitalist countries, just as in the preceding epoch she could not help introducing shops, factories, railroads, rapid-fire guns, and airplanes. Did not infrequent disputes among Russian historians of the newest school as to how far Russia was ripe for present-day imperialist policies often fall into mere scholasticism because they look upon Russia in the international arena as isolated, as an independent factor, whereas she was but one link in a system. India participated in the war both essentially and formally as a colony of England. The participation of China, though in a formal sense voluntary, was in reality the interference of a slave in the fight of his masters. The participation of Russia falls somewhere halfway between the participation of France and that of China. Russia paid in this way for her right to be an ally of advanced countries, to import capital and pay interest on it. That is essentially for her right to be a privileged colony of her allies, but at the same time for her right to oppress and rob Turkey, Persia, Galicia, and in general the countries weaker and more backward than herself. The twofold imperialism of the Russian bourgeoisie had basically the character of an agency for other mightier world powers. The Chinese compradors are the classic type of the national bourgeoisie, a kind of mediating agency between foreign finance, capital, and the economy of their own country. In the world hierarchy of the powers, Russia occupied before the war a considerably higher position than China. What position she would have occupied after the war if there had been no revolution is a different question, but the Russian autocracy on the one hand, the Russian bourgeoisie on the other, contained features of compradorism even more and more clearly expressed. They lived and nourished themselves upon their connections with foreign imperialism, served it, and without their support could not have survived. To be sure, they did not survive in the long run even with its support. The semi-comprador Russian bourgeoisie had world imperialistic interest, in the same sense in which an agent working on percentage lives by the interests of his employer. The instrument of war is the army, inasmuch as every army is considered unconquerable in the national mythology, The ruling classes of Russia saw no reason for making an exception of the army of the Tsar. In reality, however, this army was a serious force only against semi-barbaric peoples, small neighbors, and disintegrating states. On the European arena, it could act only as part of a coalition. In the matter of defense, it could fulfill its tasks only by the help of the vastness of spaces, the sparsity of population, and the impassability of the roads. The virtuoso of this army of serfs had been Suvorov. The French Revolution is breaking open the doors of the new society, and the new military art had pronounced a death sentence on the Suvorov type of army. The semi-annulment of serfdom and the introduction of universal military service had modernized the army only as far as it had the country. That is, it introduced into the army all the contradictions proper to a nation which still has its bourgeois revolution to accomplish. It is true that the Tsar's army was constructed and armed upon Western models, but this was more form than essence. There was no correspondence between the cultural level of the peasant soldier and the modern military technique. In the commanding staff, the ignorance, light-mindedness, the thievery of the ruling classes found their expression. Industry and transport continually revealed their bankruptcy before the concentrated demands of wartime. Although appropriately armed as it seemed on the first day of the war, the troops soon turned out to have neither weapons nor even shoes. In the Russo-Japanese War, the Tsarist army had shown what it was worth. In the epoch of counter-revolution, the monarchy, with the aid of the Duma, had filled up the military stores and put many new patches on the army, especially upon its reputation for invincibility. In 1914 came a new and far heavier test. In the matter of military supplies and finances, Russia at war suddenly finds herself in slavish dependence upon her allies. This is merely a military expression of her general dependence upon advanced capitalist countries, but help from allies does not save the situation. The lack of munitions, the small number of factories for their production, the sparseness of railroad lines for their transportation soon translated the backwardness of Russia into the familiar language of defeat, which served to remind the Russian national liberals that their ancestors had not accomplished the bourgeois revolution, and that the descendants therefore owed a debt to history. The first days of war were the first days of disgrace. After a series of partial catastrophes in the spring of 1915 came the general threat came the general retreat. The generals took out their own criminal incapacity on the peaceful population. Enormous tracts of land were violently laid waste. Clouds of human locusts were driven to the rear with whips. The external road was completed with an internal one. In answer to alarmed questions from his colleagues as to the situation at the front, the War Minister Polivanov answered in these words: I place my trust in the impenetrable spaces, impassable mud, and the mercy of Saint Nicholas Mirlikinsky, protector of Holy Russia, session of August 4, 1915. A week later, General Ruski confesses to the same ministers, the present-day demands of military techniques are beyond us. At any rate, we can't keep up with the Germans. That was not the mood of a moment. Officer Stankiewicz reports the words of an engineer of the corps. It is hopeless to fight with Germans, for we are in no condition to do anything. Even the new methods of fighting become the causes of our failure. There is a cloud of such testimony. The one thing the Russian generals did with a flourish was to drag human meat out of the country. Beef and pork are handled with incomparably more economy. Grey stuff non-entities like Yanushevich under Nikolaevich and Alexei under the Tsar will stop up all cracks with new mobilizations and comfort themselves and the Allies with columns of figures when columns of fighters were wanted. About 50 million men were mobilized and they brimmed the depots, barracks, points of transit, crowded, stamped, stepped on each other's feet, getting harsh and cursing. If these human masses were an imaginary magnitude for the front, for the rear they were a very real factor of destruction. About 5.5 million were counted as killed, wounded and captured. The number of deserters kept growing. Already in July 1915, the ministers chanted, "Poor Russia, even her army, which in past ages filled the world with the thunder of its victories, even her army turns out to consist only of cowards and deserters." The ministers themselves, with a gallows joke at the bravery in retreat of their generals, wasted hours in those days discussing such problems as whether to remove or not to remove the bones of the saints from Kiev. The Tsar submitted that it was not necessary, since the Germans will not risk touching them, and if they did touch them, so much the worse for the Germans. But the Synod had already started to remove them. When we leave, they said, we will take with us what is most precious. This happened not in the epoch of the Crusades, but in the 20th century, when the news of the Russian defeats came over the wireless. The Russian successes against Austria-Hungary and their roots rather in Austria-Hungary than in Russia. The disintegrating Habsburg monarchy had long ago hung out a sign for an undertaker not demanding any high qualifications of him. In the past, Russia had been successful against inwardly decomposing states like Turkey, Poland, Persia. The southwestern front of the Russian army, facing Austria, celebrated immense victories, which made it very different from the other fronts. Here there emerged a few generals who, to be sure, demonstrated no military gifts, but were at least not thoroughly imbued with the fatalism of steadily beaten commanders. From this milieu there arose subsequently several white heroes of the Civil War. Everybody was looking for someone upon whom to lay the blame. They accused the Jews wholesale of espionage. They set upon people with German names. The staff of the Grand Duke Nikolaevich gave orders to shoot a colonel of the gendarmes, Miasoyedov, as a German spy, which he obviously was not. They arrested Sukhomlinov, the war minister, and an empty and slovenly man, accusing him, possibly not without foundation, of treason. The British Minister of Foreign Affairs, Grey, said to the president of the Russian parliamentary delegation, "Your government is very bold if it dares in time of war indict its war minister for treason." The staff and the Duma accused the court of Germanophilism. All of them together envied the Allies and hated them. The French command spared its army by putting in Russian soldiers. England warmed up slowly. In the drawing rooms of Petrograd and the headquarters at the front they gently joked. England was sworn to fight to the last drop of blood of the Russian soldier. These jokes seeped down and reached the trenches. "Everything for the war," said the ministers, deputies, generals, journalists. Yes, the soldier begin to think in the trenches. They are all ready to fight to the last drop of my blood. The Russian army lost in the whole war more men than any army which ever participated in a national war. Approximately 2.5 million killed, or 40% of all the losses of the intent. In the first months, the soldiers fell under shell fire unthinkingly or thinking little, but from day to day they gathered bitter experience of the lower ranks, who are ignorantly commanded. They measured the confusion of the generals by the number of purposeless maneuvers or on soulless shoes, the number of dinners not eaten. From the bloody mass of people and things emerged a generalized word, the mess, which in the soldiers' jargon was replaced by a still juicier term. The swiftest of all to disintegrate was the peasant infantry. As a general rule, the artillery, with its high percentage of industrial workers, is distinguished by an incomparably greater hospitality to revolutionary ideas. This was clearly evident in 1905. If in 1917, on the contrary, the artillery showed more conservatism than the infantry, the cause lies in the fact that through the infantry divisions, as through a sieve, there passed ever new and less trained human masses. The artillery, moreover, suffering infinitely fewer losses, retained its original grades. The same thing was observed in other specialized troops, but in the long run the artillery yielded too. During the retreat from Galicia, a secret order was issued by the commander-in-chief, flog the soldiers for desertion and other crimes. The soldier Pireico relates, they began to flog soldiers for the most trivial offenses. For example, for a few hours, absence without leave, and sometimes they flogged them in order to rouse their fighting spirit. As early as September 17, 1915, Kuropatkin wrote citing Gushkov, the lower orders began the war with enthusiasm, but now they were weary, and with the continual retreats have lost faith in a victory. At about the same time, the Minister of the Interior spoke of the presence in Moscow of 30,000 convalescent soldiers. That's a wild crowd of libertines, knowing no discipline, rough housing, getting into fights with the police. Not long ago, a policeman was killed by the soldiers, rescuing arrested men, etc. Undoubtedly, in case of disorders, this entire horde will take the side of the mob. The same soldier Pireico writes, everyone to the last man was interested in nothing but peace. Who should win and what kind of peace it will be, that was of small interest to the army. It wanted peace at any cost, for it was weary of war.